England, 1845. The morning light filtered through the heavy damask curtains of Lady Eliza Blackwood's bedchamber, casting a soft glow upon the young woman who stood before her, looking-glass with the weight of impending doom pressing upon her slender shoulders. The reflection that stared back at her revealed a beautiful but sorrowful face framed by rich auburn hair, her emerald eyes dimmed by resignation rather than bright with bridal anticipation, as they should be on her wedding day. Martha, her lady's maid since childhood, worked silently behind her, fastening the endless row of pearl buttons that ran down the back of the elaborate ivory wedding gown, a garment that felt more like a shroud with each passing moment. Lord Blackwood had made his expectations abundantly clear 3 months prior when he had announced her betrothal to Baron Harrington, a man 40 years her senior, with a reputation for cruelty that travelled through whispered conversations in London's drawing rooms. The marriage was not a choice, but a necessity, a sacrifice demanded of Eliza to save her family from the financial ruin brought about by her father's reckless investments and gambling debts. The elaborate trousseau, the lavish ceremony, the hundreds of aristocratic guests already arriving downstairs, all were merely gilded trappings to disguise what was essentially the selling of a daughter to pay a father's debts. Eliza caught Martha's sympathetic gaze in the mirror as the maid placed the delicate lace veil upon her carefully arranged auburn curls. "This feels more like a funeral than a wedding," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive silence of the room. Martha's fingers stilled momentarily on the veil, her eyes reflecting shared understanding of the truth in those words. The beautiful spring morning beyond the window seemed a cruel mockery, the cheerful bird song and sunshine at odds with the desolation within Eliza's heart. She had once dreamed of marriage as most young women did, with hope and romantic notions of love and partnership, but those dreams had withered first under the quiet devastation of Sebastian Thornfield's inexplicable withdrawal from her life 2 seasons ago, and now lay completely crushed beneath the weight of her father's commandment. In less than 2 hours, she would speak vows binding her for life to a man whose mere presence made her skin crawl, whose rheumy eyes lingered too long on her youthful figure, whose thin lips curved in satisfied possession whenever he looked at her. Lord Blackwood's footsteps sounded in the hallway, approaching to escort his daughter to the waiting carriage that would deliver her to St. George's Chapel and her waiting groom. Eliza straightened her spine and lifted her chin, steeling herself against the tears that threatened. She would not give her father the satisfaction of witnessing her distress, nor would she arrive at her wedding with reddened eyes. If this was to be her fate, she would face it with the dignity befitting a lady of her station, even as every fibre of her being silently screamed in protest against the future closing in around her with the inexorability of iron bars. St. George's Chapel, the wedding proceeds as London's elite whisper behind fans. Eliza notices the imposing figure of Duke Sebastian Thornfield standing apart from the crowd, tall, dark-haired, with intense grey eyes. Their gazes lock momentarily, stirring an unexpected flutter in her chest. Sebastian had once courted her 2 years prior, but mysteriously withdrew, leaving her heartbroken. His presence now seems a cruel reminder of what could have been. Baron Harrington, 40 years her senior, wheezes as he recites his vows, while Sebastian watches with barely concealed contempt. St. George's Chapel stood resplendent in the morning light, its Gothic arches soaring heavenward as hundreds of aristocratic guests filled the ancient pews, a sea of silk gowns and formal attire rustling beneath the vaulted ceiling. Eliza moved down the aisle on her father's arm with practiced grace that belied the hollow ache in her chest, her eyes fixed on the aged figure awaiting her at the altar. Baron Harrington's thin frame, draped in expensive tailoring that could not disguise the frailty of his 70 years. As she took her place beside her groom, the subtle whispers behind jeweled fans reached her ears. The elite of London society speculating on the obvious disparity of the match, the waste of youth and beauty sacrificed to age and wealth. It was then that a prickling awareness drew her gaze involuntarily to the back of the chapel, where a tall figure stood apart from the crowd. His broad shoulders and commanding presence, unmistakable even before her eyes confirmed what her heart already knew. Duke Sebastian Thornfield watched the proceedings with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the very air between them. His dark hair swept back from features that haunted her dreams still, his grey eyes meeting hers across the chapel with an expression she could not decipher. The unexpected flutter in her chest betrayed her, a traitorous reminder of feelings she had fought to bury since he had withdrawn his courtship 2 years prior without explanation, leaving her bewildered and heartbroken. His presence now seemed a particularly cruel twist of fate, forcing her to confront the memory of genuine affection while pledging herself to a loveless union. What right had he to witness her surrender, to stand in silent judgment as she did what necessity demanded? The ceremony continued relentlessly as the vicar intoned the ancient words that would bind her to Baron Harrington, whose breathing came in audible wheezes as he repeated his vows, his parchment hand cold and dry as it clutched hers with possessive insistence. Eliza spoke her own responses by rote, feeling disconnected from the words that sealed her future, her peripheral vision traitorously aware of Sebastian shifting his stance, the slight tightening of his jaw visible even at this distance. She wondered with a surge of bitter resentment whether he had come to satisfy some perverse curiosity, to witness the culmination of the path his rejection had set her upon. The Baron completed his vows with a rattling cough that drew concerned glances from those nearest. But his watery blue eyes gleamed with triumph as the vicar pronounced them man and wife. As Eliza turned to face the congregation on the arm of her new husband, her gaze was again drawn inexorably to Sebastian, whose expression had hardened to barely concealed contempt as he watched the Baron pat her hand with proprietary satisfaction. Something passed between them in that moment, some unspoken communication that stirred questions in Eliza she had thought long answered. Then the organ thundered forth, and she was moving down the aisle, the Baroness Harrington now, the ring heavy on her finger and Sebastian Thornfield a rigid figure in her wake, a ghost of possibility that had no place in the life that stretched before her like an endless, barren plain. Blackwood Manor blazed with light, its grand ballroom transformed for the wedding feast as hundreds of candles illuminated the sea of aristocratic faces that surrounded Eliza at the high table. She sat rigidly beside Baron Harrington, the heavy gold band on her finger seeming to weigh down her entire body as she moved her food listlessly around her plate, unable to summon even the pretense of appetite despite the sumptuous fare laid before the wedding guests. The Baron appeared not to notice her distress, too occupied with accepting congratulations and consuming alarming quantities of wine, his thin lips stained purple as he spoke loudly to Lord Blackwood about hunting plans for the autumn at his estate, where Eliza would soon be mistress. The endless procession of well-wishers had begun to blur together when a familiar voice cut through her consciousness, causing her to look up sharply into the face that had once been more dear to her than any other. Duke Sebastian Thornfield stood before them, his formal attire accentuating the powerful breadth of his shoulders, his expression carefully neutral as he bowed to the newly wedded couple. "I wish you every happiness, Lady Harrington, though I question whether you will find it with this match," he said, the undercurrent of tension in his deep voice belying the conventional felicitations. The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that sent a chill down Eliza's spine, even as the Baron bristled visibly beside her, his watery eyes narrowing with displeasure at the barely veiled insult. Harrington responded with a wheezing laugh that failed to mask his annoyance, pulling Eliza possessively closer with a hand that gripped her arm too tightly. "You forget yourself, Thornfield. My wife has secured a title and fortune most young ladies would envy. She will want for nothing under my protection." Something dangerous flashed in Sebastian's grey eyes at the word protection, but his face remained impassive as he inclined his head in acknowledgement without conceding the point. As he turned to leave, his sleeve brushed against Martha, who stood dutifully behind Eliza's chair, and Eliza caught the almost imperceptible movement of his hand as something passed between them. The interaction lasted mere seconds, yet the Baron appeared not to notice, already turning his attention to the Countess of Wexley, who approached to offer her congratulations. It was nearly an hour later, as Eliza excused herself to visit the ladies' retiring room, that Martha pressed a small, folded paper into her palm with trembling fingers. Alone for a precious moment, Eliza unfolded the note with unsteady hands, her heart thundering against her ribs as she recognized the bold, slanting script she had once received in courtship letters. "Your husband is not what he seems. Be vigilant." The cryptic warning sent ice through her veins, confirming the nameless dread that had plagued her since the announcement of her engagement. She destroyed the note immediately, crushing it in the fireplace and watching the paper curl and blacken among the flames. When she returned to the ballroom, her eyes sought Sebastian's tall figure among the guests, but he had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving only his warning and the disturbing questions it raised about the man who now possessed legal rights to her person and property. The Baron's hand closed around hers once more as the musicians prepared for the first dance, his thin fingers cold against her skin, and Eliza wondered with growing unease what secrets lay behind his rheumy eyes, and what danger Sebastian had risked himself to warn her against. Evening descended upon Blackwood Manor as the wedding feast progressed into its final hours, the muted golden glow of candelabras casting long shadows across the faces of guests who lingered for the culmination of the celebrations. Baron Harrington rose from his seat at the high table, his frail frame swaying slightly from the effects of wine consumed throughout the day. Yet his eyes remained unsettlingly alert as they fixed upon his young bride with an intensity that made Eliza suppress a shiver. Silence fell across the banquet hall as the Baron tapped his knife against his crystal goblet, drawing all attention to the head table where he stood beside Eliza, his parchment hand suddenly gripping her arm with surprising strength. "A special toast to my beautiful bride," he announced, his voice carrying through the hall despite its reedy quality. A servant appeared at his gesture, bearing a silver tray with a single goblet filled with wine of a peculiar deep crimson hue, almost too dark to be natural. "Let us seal our union with this ancient Harrington tradition, my dear." As the servant placed the unusual goblet before her, Eliza glanced up instinctively and found Sebastian had reappeared among the guests. Standing rigidly near the entrance to the ballroom, his grey eyes locked on the wine with such naked alarm that her heart began to race. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the ornate vessel, some primal instinct urging her to reject it, despite the hundreds of eyes watching expectantly. The Baron leaned closer, his breath sour against her ear as his fingers dug painfully into her forearm. "Drink, my dear wife, to seal our union," he insisted, the command unmistakable beneath the veneer of affection, his watery eyes now hard with warning. Trapped between her husband's grip and the scrutiny of London society, Eliza felt panic rising in her throat as she lifted the heavy goblet with trembling fingers. Across the room, Sebastian suddenly moved, pushing through the crowd with urgent purpose. But the distance was too great and the press of guests too thick for him to reach her in time. With the Baron's hand still vice-like upon her arm, Eliza raised the goblet to her lips and drank deeply, propriety and obedience overriding the warning that screamed in her mind. The liquid slid down her throat, unexpectedly bitter and strange, leaving a burning sensation in its wake that she knew instantly was not merely the bite of strong wine. She caught Sebastian's expression of horror as he froze midway across the room, too late to prevent what had already occurred. The Baron released her arm with a satisfied nod, accepting congratulations from nearby guests who raised their own glasses in response to the toast, seemingly oblivious to the peculiarity of the ritual. Only Sebastian remained motionless amid the celebrating crowd, his face a mask of barely contained fury and fear as Eliza set down the goblet with hands that had begun to tremble noticeably. Already she could feel an unnatural warmth spreading from her stomach outward, her vision blurring slightly at the edges as she struggled to maintain her composure, the bitter taste lingering on her tongue like a harbinger of something far worse to come. Minutes passed as Eliza struggled to maintain her composure, the formal smile fixed upon her lips beginning to tremble as the burning sensation in her stomach intensified, spreading upward through her chest with alarming swiftness. The banquet hall seemed to tilt and sway around her, the faces of guests blurring into indistinct shapes as her vision clouded at the edges and her breathing became labored, each breath a painful struggle against the invisible vice tightening around her lungs. She clutched at the edge of the table, her knuckles white with effort as she fought to remain upright, but the weakness spreading through her limbs proved too powerful to resist. A violent tremor seized her body, and she collapsed from her chair, crumpling to the floor in a swirl of ivory silk and lace as the first screams of alarm rose from the guests nearest the high table. Through the haze of encroaching darkness, Eliza was dimly aware of the pandemonium erupting throughout the ballroom, women crying out in horror and men shouting for a physician as the festivities dissolved into chaos. Her fading consciousness registered Sebastian, shoving people roughly aside. His face contorted with desperate urgency as he fought to reach her through the crush of confused guests and servants. The Baron remained oddly still amid the commotion, making no move to assist his fallen bride, watching instead with an expression of detached interest that seemed grotesquely out of place, as though observing an experiment whose outcome he found mildly fascinating, rather than witnessing his wife in mortal distress. Eliza felt herself being gathered into strong arms, her head cradled against a broad chest as Sebastian knelt beside her on the floor, his voice cutting through the cacophony of panicked voices surrounding them. "Poison. I feared this," he said, his tone urgent but controlled, as his fingers pressed against the pulse at her throat, finding it rapid and weakening. His grey eyes, so close now, blazed with a combination of fury and fear as he shouted for space, for water, for his carriage to be brought around immediately. Through the roaring in her ears, Eliza heard the Baron speak, his thin voice carrying a note of cold amusement that chilled her, despite the fire consuming her insides. "You cannot save her, Thornfield. The compound acts too quickly." His words held no trace of the doddering old man he had presented himself to be, instead revealing a calculation and malice that confirmed all of Sebastian's warnings in a single moment of horrifying clarity. Eliza tried to speak, to ask why, to understand what evil had befallen her on what should have been merely a day of resigned sadness rather than mortal peril, but her throat constricted painfully, permitting only a weak gasp that brought the metallic taste of blood to her tongue. She felt herself being lifted, Sebastian rising to his feet with her limp form in his arms, his voice a distant rumble against her ear as consciousness began to slip away entirely. "Hold on, Eliza. Do not leave me. Not now, when I have finally found you again." The words followed her into the darkness as her head fell back over his arm, her body surrendering to the poison that raced through her veins with merciless efficiency. The ballroom and its occupants fading into nothingness as Sebastian carried her swiftly from the hall. Sebastian raced through the manor's winding corridors with Eliza's limp form cradled against his chest, her head lolling lifelessly as he took the stairs 2 at a time. Desperate to reach privacy before the poison completed its deadly work. Behind him echoed shouts and the Baron's reedy voice demanding the return of his bride, but Sebastian pressed forward with single-minded purpose until he reached a small sitting room off the east wing. Martha followed close behind, her face streaked with tears, closing the heavy oak door as Sebastian gently laid Eliza upon a chaise longue, her skin now frighteningly pale against the crimson velvet. Quickly, he barricaded the door with a chair wedged beneath the handle as the first angry pounding began, the Baron's muffled demands for entry barely registering as Sebastian turned his full attention to the woman fighting for each shallow breath before him. From an inner pocket of his waistcoat, he withdrew a small crystal vial containing a clear liquid. His hand steady despite the chaos erupting in the hallway beyond the door and the panicked sobbing of Martha, who had collapsed into a nearby chair, her hands covering her mouth to stifle the sounds of her distress. Sebastian knelt beside the chaise, one strong arm sliding beneath Eliza's shoulders to lift her head and upper body, her auburn hair spilling across his sleeve like liquid fire against the dark fabric. "This antidote may save her, but she must drink it now," he said, his voice commanding yet tinged with a desperation that revealed how precarious her situation truly was. "She will die without it." Eliza's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and clouded with pain, a small moan escaping her lips as Sebastian uncorked the vial with his teeth, spitting the stopper aside without concern for propriety or decorum. With gentle yet insistent pressure, he parted her lips with his fingers and poured the liquid directly into her mouth, tilting her head back to ensure the precious antidote reached her throat rather than spilling uselessly down her chin. When her body convulsed against the intrusion, threatening to reject the cure, Sebastian pressed his hand firmly against her mouth, forcing her to swallow despite her unconscious resistance, his touch paradoxically tender even in its unyielding insistence. "Drink, Eliza, please," he murmured, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper as the last of the liquid disappeared between her pale lips. The intimate urgency of the moment stripped away all pretense, revealing raw emotion in every line of his powerful frame as he cradled her against his chest, one hand stroking her hair with infinite gentleness while they waited for the antidote to take effect. "Live, Eliza," he whispered, his lips close to her ear, his words meant for her alone, though Martha could not help but overhear from her position across the room. "I cannot lose you again, not when I have finally found the courage to reclaim what I so foolishly surrendered." The naked vulnerability in his voice revealed depths of feeling that transcended mere concern or obligation, exposing the truth that Sebastian Thornfield had never ceased to love the woman now fighting for her life in his arms. Outside, the pounding on the door intensified as Lord Blackwood joined the Baron in demanding entry, their voices rising with indignation and threats of legal consequence. But Sebastian remained focused entirely on Eliza, watching intently for any sign that the antidote was counteracting the deadly poison the Baron had so callously administered to his bride of mere hours. Night fell over Blackwood Manor, the wedding festivities long since abandoned, as hushed whispers travelled through darkened corridors, speculation running rampant among guests and servants alike about the sudden illness of the bride and the shocking intervention of the Duke of Thornfield. In the small sitting room, now transformed into a sick room, Eliza battled the poison that coursed through her veins, her slender form racked with violent fevers that caused her to alternate between shivering uncontrollably and burning with unnatural heat. Sebastian maintained his vigil unwaveringly through the long hours, refusing all suggestions that he rest or allow someone else to watch over her. his powerful frame bent with exhaustion as he continuously bathed her forehead with cool cloths and monitored her labored breathing for any sign of improvement or decline. Martha had been persuaded to rest in an adjoining room after Sebastian promised to wake her should any change occur, leaving him alone with Eliza as the grandfather clock in the corner marked the slow passage of midnight into the early hours of morning. During brief moments of lucidity, Eliza would open her eyes to find his face above hers, grey eyes dark with concern, but consciousness never lasted long before fever dreams pulled her back into swirling visions of weddings and poisons, of Sebastian walking away from her 2 years ago without explanation, of the Baron watching her collapse with that terrible detached interest. In one such moment of clarity, she managed to form a single word: why? The question encompassing both her present situation and the abandonment that had preceded it by 2 years. Sebastian understood all she asked in that single syllable, his hand stilling on her brow as he finally revealed what had driven every action since their courtship abruptly ended. I discovered 2 years ago that Harrington was involved in a poisoning ring targeting wealthy spouses for inheritance, he explained, his deep voice soft in the quiet room, exhaustion evident in every line of his face as he continued to bathe her heated skin. The Baron has buried 3 wives already, each death attributed to natural causes, but each occurring within a year of marriage after the victim had altered their will in his favor. I have been gathering evidence since then, working with certain officials at Scotland Yard, building a case strong enough to bring him to justice. I withdrew from our courtship to protect you, Eliza, he confessed, pain etching itself across his features as he recalled the decision that had wounded them both so deeply. Had we married, you would have become a target for Harrington's vengeance once I moved against him. But when I heard of your engagement, I knew you were in immediate danger. Ironically, you became his victim anyway, despite everything I sacrificed to keep you safe. The bitter self-recrimination in his voice broke through even Eliza's fever-induced haze, and she managed to lift one trembling hand to touch his cheek briefly before exhaustion forced her arm back to the cushions. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with the first pale streaks of light, Eliza's breathing gradually eased and her skin cooled beneath Sebastian's touch, the violent fever finally breaking after hours of desperate struggle. The antidote had worked, drawing the poison from her system through the long night of suffering. Sebastian's relief was palpable, his powerful shoulders sagging as he pressed his forehead briefly against her hand, an uncharacteristic display of vulnerability from a man known throughout London for his rigid self-control. "You will live, Eliza Blackwood," he whispered, using her maiden name deliberately, as though already severing her connection to the man who had attempted to murder her mere hours after speaking sacred vows. "And Harrington will pay for what he has done, both to you and to those who came before." Morning light streamed through the windows of the small sitting room where Eliza gradually returned to consciousness, her body aching as though she had endured a terrible illness, memories of the previous night's events returning in disjointed fragments. She opened her eyes to find Sebastian slumped in a chair beside her, his powerful frame folded uncomfortably into the too small furniture, his head tilted at an angle that would surely result in pain upon waking. Deep shadows beneath his eyes testified to his vigil, his cravat loosened and waistcoat unbuttoned, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that would horrify his valet. Eliza studied him in this rare, unguarded moment, struck by how the years had added a certain gravity to features she had once known as well as her own. Fine lines at the corners of his eyes speaking of burdens carried in silence. The peaceful moment shattered as the door suddenly burst open with a crash that jolted Sebastian instantly awake, his body uncoiling from the chair with the reflexive readiness of a man accustomed to danger. Baron Harrington swept into the room, followed by 2 stern-faced constables in uniform, his frail appearance from the previous day replaced by cold fury as he pointed a trembling finger at Sebastian. "This is the man, officers!" the Baron declared, his reedy voice vibrating with righteous indignation. "The Duke of Thornfield poisoned my bride in a fit of jealous rage. He has been obsessed with her for years and could not bear to see her wed to another. He abducted her from our wedding feast with the intention of killing her and making it appear I was responsible." Sebastian rose to his full height, towering over the Baron with barely contained anger, his voice controlled but resonant with authority, as he addressed the constables rather than responding directly to Harrington's accusations. "It is the Baron who administered the poison, gentlemen. In a special toast he insisted his bride drink alone. I simply provided the antidote, having suspected his intentions based on the suspicious deaths of his previous 3 wives. I suggest you investigate the goblet from which Lady Harrington drank. You will find traces of a particular compound Harrington has used before." The constables shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain whom to believe as they looked between the Duke, whose reputation for integrity was well established throughout London, and the Baron, whose age and apparent frailty naturally elicited sympathy despite the seriousness of the dueling accusations. The older officer cleared his throat awkwardly, addressing himself to Eliza, who struggled to sit upright against the cushions, her strength not yet fully returned after the night's ordeal. "My lady, perhaps you might clarify what transpired. Your testimony would be most illuminating in this unfortunate situation." All eyes turned to Eliza, the Baron's gaze suddenly sharp with warning, Sebastian's filled with concern for her still weakened state, the constables watchful and assessing as they awaited her response. Though barely able to hold herself upright, Eliza recognized the pivotal moment for what it was, understanding that her next words would determine not only her own fate, but potentially that of other women who might fall victim to the Baron if she failed to speak the truth. The law favored husbands absolutely, giving them control over their wives' persons, property, and testimony. Yet Eliza knew she must find the strength to defy those constraints if justice were to prevail. She took a deep breath, steadying herself against the residual weakness that made her limbs tremble, and prepared to make the choice that would set the course for everything that followed. The constables departed reluctantly after Eliza carefully recounted the events, claiming exhaustion had clouded her memory of precisely how she fell ill, but requesting time to recover before making any formal accusation. Her diplomatic response satisfied neither man entirely, but provided temporary reprieve as they promised to return the following day for her complete statement. Sebastian withdrew with visible reluctance when Lord Blackwood insisted on speaking with him privately about the scandalous situation, leaving Eliza alone with the Baron for the first time since her collapse. As the door closed behind them, the transformation in Baron Harrington was immediate and chilling, his stooped posture straightening, the tremor in his hands disappearing as though it had been merely an affectation, his watery eyes suddenly sharp with malevolent clarity. He moved toward the chaise where Eliza lay still too weak to stand, his thin lips curved in a smile entirely devoid of warmth as he loomed over her with surprising vigor for a man of his years. "You should have died quietly, my dear," he said, his voice no longer reedy but cold and precise, each word carefully enunciated as he reached out to stroke her cheek with fingers that felt like the touch of a corpse. 3 previous wives did, without all this unpleasant fuss. A simple toast, a peaceful passing in their sleep, and their fortunes transferred neatly to my accounts. The unexpected revelation of his true nature rendered Eliza momentarily speechless, the full horror of Sebastian's warnings crystallizing into terrifying reality as the Baron continued his monologue, seemingly unconcerned that she might report his words to others. "But no matter," he continued, withdrawing a small silver box from his waistcoat pocket and opening it to reveal a fine white powder. "I will simply finish what I started, and your devoted Duke will hang for it." Such a tragic tale of obsession. The noble Duke of Thornfield so consumed with jealousy that he poisoned his former love rather than see her belong to another. The courts will be most sympathetic to a grieving husband, particularly one with my connections. The aged face she had once found merely unpleasant now appeared monstrous in its calculated cruelty. The mask of respectability completely dissolved to reveal the predator beneath as he approached with clear intent, the open box of poison held before him like an offering. Eliza tried to push herself upright, to call for help, but her limbs remained treacherously weak from the previous night's ordeal, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper as she struggled against the cushions. The Baron reached for her with frightening purpose, his free hand moving to grip her jaw and force her mouth open, when the door suddenly opened and Martha entered carrying a tray of tea, her eyes widening in horror at the tableau before her. The maid froze in the doorway, the tray trembling in her hands as she witnessed the Baron poised above her mistress with unmistakable murderous intent, the evidence of his true nature displayed plainly in both his posture and the poison he still held. In the suspended moment of shocked silence, Eliza saw understanding dawn in Martha's face, followed swiftly by determination as the loyal servant backed out of the room without a word, clearly intent on summoning help. The Baron whirled toward the door with a snarl of frustration, snapping the silver box closed and returning it to his pocket. As the opportunity for completing his deed evaporated with the presence of a witness. "We are not finished, Lady Harrington," he hissed, his facade of elderly frailty returning like a well-worn cloak as voices approached in the corridor outside. "You would be wise to remember that legally, you remain my wife, my property, and your testimony against me would be worthless in any court in England." His threat lingered in the air between them as Sebastian burst through the doorway with Martha close behind him, the Duke's expression darkening to thunderous rage as he registered the scene before him and the terror evident in Eliza's pale face. 2 days after the fateful wedding, Sebastian returned to Blackwood Manor at dawn, his expression grimly triumphant as he strode through the entrance hall, a leather document case clutched tightly in one hand. He had spent the intervening time gathering testimonies from servants who had worked in Harrington households when previous wives had died, along with a chemist willing to testify about unusual purchases the Baron had made in the weeks preceding each death. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, enough to justify a more thorough investigation by the authorities, who had initially been skeptical of such accusations against a peer of the realm. Sebastian took the stairs 2 at a time, eager to share this development with Eliza, who had been recuperating under Martha's watchful care in a guest chamber far from the Baron's assigned rooms. His mounting anticipation dissolved into instant alarm when he found the room empty, the bed neatly made as though it had not been slept in, no sign of either Eliza or her loyal maid anywhere in the chamber. A folded paper on the dressing table caught his eye, his name written in Martha's neat hand across the outside. He tore it open, scanning the contents with increasing urgency, as the maid's words revealed the chilling confrontation she had witnessed and the desperate action it had prompted. "Sir, we could not wait for your return," Martha had written. "After what I saw and heard, I feared for my mistress's life every moment she remained under this roof. The Baron openly threatened to complete his murderous scheme and implicate you in her death. I have taken Lady Harrington to Thornfield Hall, as you once mentioned. It was the safest place you knew. We left by the servants' entrance at midnight. God willing, this note finds you before the Baron discovers her absence." Sebastian crushed the note in his fist, simultaneously relieved that Eliza was beyond Harrington's immediate reach, and alarmed at the perilous journey the 2 women had undertaken alone. Even as these thoughts raced through his mind, angry shouts erupted from the floor below as the Baron's voice rose in accusation, the word kidnapped cutting clearly through the morning quiet of the manor house. Moving swiftly to the window, Sebastian observed a grim tableau unfolding in the courtyard below. The Baron stood surrounded by several rough-looking men who were clearly not constables, gesturing wildly as he issued orders, his pretense of frailty entirely abandoned in his fury. Servants peered anxiously from windows and doorways as Lord Blackwood attempted to calm the situation, his own face ashen with concern for his daughter's reputation as much as her safety. Sebastian knew with cold certainty that he had precious little time to act. The Baron would soon have men searching every road to Thornfield Hall once he deduced where Eliza might have fled, and 2 women travelling alone would make easy targets for the hired thugs who now filled the courtyard below. With the silent efficiency born of military training, Sebastian slipped from the room and made his way to the stables through a side entrance, avoiding the commotion at the front of the house. Within minutes he was galloping away from Blackwood Manor, pushing his stallion to a punishing pace as he took less travelled roads toward his ancestral estate, racing against both Harrington's men and the scandal that would soon erupt across London as the Baron publicly accused him of abducting another man's wife. The peaceful English countryside flew past in a blur of green fields and hedgerows, Sebastian's mind calculating distances and time, estimating where Eliza and Martha might be if they had left at midnight as the note suggested, and where they might encounter the danger that now pursued them with murderous intent. Thornfield Hall rose majestically against the twilight sky, a sprawling Tudor mansion whose ancient stones seemed to glow with amber warmth as the setting sun cast long shadows across its vast parkland. Eliza observed the imposing structure from the hired carriage window. Her body still weak from the poison and the harrowing journey, Martha's supportive arm around her shoulders as they approached the estate that represented their only hope of sanctuary. The journey had been arduous, undertaken in stades with frequent stops to allow Eliza to rest, their progress slowed by the necessity of avoiding main roads where the Baron's men might be watching. As their carriage rolled to a stop before the grand entrance, the massive oak doors swung open immediately as though their arrival had been anticipated, revealing a line of servants headed by an elegant older woman whose bearing suggested authority beyond that of an ordinary housekeeper. "Welcome to Thornfield Hall, Lady Harrington," the woman said, stepping forward to assist Eliza from the carriage with surprising strength for her years. "I am Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper. His Grace sent no word of your coming, but we shall make you comfortable nonetheless." Despite her near exhaustion, Eliza noted the lack of surprise in the servants' faces, the absence of the confusion one would expect when unexpected visitors arrived at a ducal residence without its master. Instead, she encountered knowing glances exchanged among the staff as Mrs. Winters efficiently directed footmen to bring their meagre luggage and instructed a maid to prepare hot baths and light refreshments. The housekeeper herself guided Eliza through the grand entrance hall with its soaring timbered ceiling and ancestral portraits, up a magnificent carved staircase, and along a corridor to a suite of rooms in the east wing that overlooked formal gardens now silvered with evening dew. "This chamber has been prepared for some time, my lady," Mrs. Winters said, as she opened the door to reveal an exquisite bedroom decorated in shades of blue and gold, a cheerful fire already crackling in the grate, despite the lack of advance notice of their arrival. "His Grace has spoken of you often," she continued, her tone matter-of-fact as she moved about the room, adjusting curtains and checking that everything was in order. "This room has been maintained for years, just in case." The simple statement hung in the air as the housekeeper discreetly withdrew, leaving Eliza to absorb the implications of a chamber kept ready for a woman Sebastian had ostensibly abandoned 2 years earlier. Too exhausted for further contemplation that night, Eliza surrendered to the care of a kindly maid who helped her bathe and change into a nightgown that fit perfectly, despite having been provided from the household stores rather than her own luggage. She fell into dreamless sleep almost instantly, her body claiming the rest it desperately needed to continue healing. Morning brought greater strength, and with it, curiosity. After breaking her fast with a light meal served in her chamber, Eliza explored the suite that had allegedly been waiting for her arrival for years. The sitting room adjoining her bedroom held a collection of books arranged on shelves built into an alcove beside the fireplace, and as she examined the titles, Eliza felt her breath catch in her throat. Each volume represented an author or work she had once mentioned admiring during her brief courtship with Sebastian. From obscure poetry collections to scholarly works on art and history that most men would consider unsuitable for female readers. On the walls hung delicate watercolors depicting scenes from Italy and Greece, countries she had expressed a desire to visit someday, while a writing desk by the window held stationery in her favorite shade of cream with the subtle scent of lavender, a preference she had mentioned only once during a garden walk years ago. Each discovery revealed another thread in a tapestry of remembrance and attention that defied explanation if Sebastian had truly ceased to care for her, painting instead a portrait of a man who had continued to hold her in his thoughts despite the painful separation he had imposed for her protection. The room itself stood as silent testimony to his enduring devotion. A sanctuary created in her absence and maintained faithfully during years when he had no reason to believe she would ever occupy it, yet could not bring himself to abandon the possibility entirely. Night had fallen by the time Sebastian reached Thornfield Hall, a violent summer storm having erupted during the final miles of his journey, turning country lanes into muddy streams and drenching him to the skin despite his heavy riding cloak. Thunder cracked overhead as he dismounted in the courtyard, tossing the reins of his exhausted stallion to a waiting groom and taking the mansion steps 2 at a time, his boots leaving wet prints across the marble entrance hall as he strode inside with singular purpose. Mrs. Winters appeared immediately, her normally composed features betraying relief at his arrival. "She is safe, Your Grace," the housekeeper informed him before he could form the question. "Lady Harrington arrived yesterday evening with her maid. I placed her in the blue suite as you had instructed, should she ever come to Thornfield." Sebastian closed his eyes briefly, the tension of the desperate ride momentarily giving way to overwhelming relief before the urgency of their situation reasserted itself. "There may be men following her, Mrs. Winters. Double the guards at all entrances and ensure no one approaches the house without my knowledge." The housekeeper nodded, recognizing the gravity in his tone, and departed to implement his orders as Sebastian took the stairs with long strides, water dripping from his sodden clothing onto the priceless carpet runner. He paused only briefly outside the door to the blue suite, drawing a deep breath before knocking, uncertain of his reception after all that had transpired. When no answer came, concern drove him to open the door cautiously, finding the bedchamber empty, though signs of occupation were evident in the personal items arranged on the dressing table. A maid directed him to the library, where Eliza had gone to select reading material, her strength having returned sufficiently for short walks within the house. Sebastian found her standing before the fireplace, the dancing flames highlighting the copper undertones in her auburn hair as she examined a leather-bound volume from his collection, so absorbed in its contents that she did not immediately notice his entrance. He stood motionless in the doorway, drinking in the sight of her alive and safe within his home. The gravity of how close he had come to losing her forever, striking him with physical force. "Eliza," he said softly, his voice roughened by exhaustion and emotion. She turned at the sound, the book slipping from her fingers to the carpet as their eyes met across the room, the carefully maintained composure of years crumbling in an instant as he crossed to her in 3 long strides and gathered her against his chest, heedless of his wet clothing or the proprieties that should have governed their interaction. The storm outside seemed to mirror the emotional tempest within the room as Sebastian finally released his hold, stepping back just enough to search her face while keeping his hands on her shoulders, as though afraid she might vanish if he let go completely. "I rode like a madman when I found your note," he confessed, rainwater still dripping from his dark hair onto his face. "When I think of what could have happened to you on the roads, of Harrington finding you before I could reach you." The careful reserve that had characterized their every previous interaction dissolved entirely as Sebastian guided her to sit beside him on the leather sofa before the fire, still holding her hand as though it were a lifeline. "I have loved you since the moment we met, Eliza," he said, the words tumbling forth after years of suppression, his grey eyes reflecting both firelight and the raw vulnerability of absolute truth. "Leaving you was the greatest sacrifice of my life, but I learned of Harrington's murder of his previous wives too late, after I had already compromised your safety by showing interest in you. I have spent 2 years building a case against him, waiting until I could ensure your security before approaching you again. Every day of that separation was agony, knowing you believed I had abandoned you without cause, watching from a distance as your light dimmed and your spirit withdrew." His confession poured forth without artifice or calculation, stripped of all pretense by the culmination of danger, fear, and final reunion, laying bare the truth of actions that had wounded them both so deeply. Eliza listened in stunned silence as the missing pieces of the puzzle finally aligned. The mystery of Sebastian's abrupt withdrawal and his unexpected reappearance at her wedding, now illuminated by the terrible danger that had shadowed them both, unknown to her until it had nearly claimed her life. Silence filled the library as Sebastian's confession hung in the air between them. The only sounds the crackling of flames in the hearth and the persistent drumming of rain against the windows. Eliza remained motionless on the sofa beside him, her mind struggling to reconcile years of hurt with the devastating truth he had revealed, the cruel necessity that had driven him to wound them both so deeply. His face remained turned toward the fire, his profile etched in sharp relief against the dancing light, unwilling or unable to meet her gaze as he awaited her response to the truth he had carried alone for so long. Eliza studied him in that unguarded moment, seeing beyond the powerful duke that society knew to the man beneath, the burden of solitary knowledge evident in the tightness around his eyes and the weary slope of his shoulders. "You sacrificed our happiness to protect me," she said finally. The simple statement encompassing a depth of understanding that mere words could never fully express. Sebastian turned to face her then, vulnerability raw in his expression as he nodded, unable to formulate a verbal response to the gentle absolution she offered. Eliza moved toward him with newfound clarity, all the confusion and hurt of the past transforming into crystalline understanding of what he had endured for her sake. She lifted her hand to his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw, feeling the slight roughness of stubble beneath her touch. Their eyes locked in silent communion before Eliza closed the remaining distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that began with tentative gentleness, but quickly deepened into something far more profound. Years of suppressed longing and newly discovered truth converged in that moment as Sebastian responded with equal fervor, his arms encircling her waist to draw her closer, the dampness of his clothing forgotten as they surrendered to the culmination of emotions too powerful to deny any longer. It was Sebastian who pulled away first, his breathing unsteady as he rested his forehead against hers, his hands moving to her shoulders to create a small space between them, even as his eyes betrayed his reluctance to do so. "You are still married, Eliza," he reminded her, his voice rough with restrained desire. "Until Harrington is brought to justice. I cannot dishonor you, no matter how desperately I wish to claim you as my own. The words cost him visibly, honor warring with desire in every line of his powerful frame, his hands tightening briefly on her shoulders before deliberately releasing her and rising to stand before the fire, putting physical distance between them, though his eyes never left her face. Where another man might have taken advantage of their isolation and her vulnerable position, Sebastian chose restraint, his sense of honor prevailing despite the passion that clearly burned within him. Eliza felt a fresh wave of love wash over her at this evidence of his character, understanding that his withdrawal now came from the same protective instinct that had driven him away 2 years earlier, stemming not from lack of feeling, but from its overwhelming presence. "We will find a way, Sebastian," she said softly, remaining seated on the sofa rather than following him, respecting the boundary he had established at such personal cost. "But know this, I am yours in every way that matters, regardless of what legal documents may temporarily claim. A piece of paper forced upon me through my father's desperation does not bind my heart." The declaration hung between them, both promise and torment. As thunder crashed outside, nature's dramatic accompaniment to the emotional tempest contained within the library walls, their reunion both healing and incomplete as external dangers continued to threaten the fragile happiness they had rediscovered within each other's presence. The tranquil atmosphere of Thornfield Hall shattered 3 days after Eliza's arrival, when a footman burst into the morning room where she and Sebastian sat planning their strategy for bringing the Baron to justice, the evidence Sebastian had gathered spread across the polished mahogany table between them. The servant's face was pale with alarm as he delivered the news that had sent him running through the house in search of his master. "Baron Harrington approaches with constables, Your Grace, not more than a 1/4 mile down the main road. They appear most determined, and the Baron himself leads the party rather than sending subordinates." The peaceful breakfast instantly transformed into urgent activity as Sebastian gathered the documents with swift efficiency, securing them in a locked drawer before turning to Eliza with grave intensity. "We have precious little time," he said, taking her hand and leading her swiftly from the room, his longer strides forcing her to nearly run to keep pace as they moved through corridors she had not yet explored during her brief residence. "I feared this might happen once the Baron traced your whereabouts. He clearly means to force your return using legal authority, as you remain his wife under law regardless of his crimes against you." Sebastian led her to the ancestral portrait gallery, where he pressed a hidden mechanism behind a particular frame, revealing a narrow doorway previously invisible within the oak paneling. "This passage leads to the old chapel ruins at the eastern edge of the estate," he explained, his voice low and urgent as he lit a lamp from a nearby sconce and handed it to her. "The remains lie on consecrated ground that technically falls under church jurisdiction rather than mine, creating a legal complexity that may give us precious time should Harrington attempt to search for you there. Wait until I send Martha or Mrs. Winters with word that it is safe to return." Before she could step into the passage, Eliza grasped his arm, the question that had haunted her for days finally finding voice in this moment of imminent separation. "Why did you never tell me the truth, Sebastian? Why not trust me with the real reason you withdrew, rather than leaving me to believe you had simply tired of our attachment?" Sebastian's expression softened momentarily, despite the urgency of their situation, his free hand rising to brush her cheek in a fleeting caress. "Because you would have insisted on facing the danger at my side, and I could not risk losing you," he answered without hesitation, the simple truth laying bare both his understanding of her character and the depth of his protective instinct. "I know your courage, Eliza, your determination when you believe something right. You would never have allowed me to confront Harrington alone once you knew the truth, and I could not bear the thought of him turning his vengeance upon you." The distant sound of carriage wheels on gravel reached them, spurring Sebastian to press a swift kiss to her forehead before guiding her into the passage. "Go now," he urged, his expression hardening once more with resolve as he prepared to face the Baron and whatever legal entanglements he had brought to Thornfield Hall. "Trust that I will find a way to protect you, as I have always sought to do, however imperfectly." The hidden door closed between them, leaving Eliza to make her way through the narrow stone passage by lamplight, her heart divided between fear for their precarious situation and a newfound certainty that Sebastian's every action, however painful in execution, had been motivated by love too profound to allow her safety to be compromised, even at the cost of their mutual happiness. Sebastian stood alone in the grand entrance hall of Thornfield Hall, his powerful frame silhouetted against the morning light, streaming through the tall windows as he awaited the arrival of his unwelcome visitors. He had changed into formal attire befitting his station, the Duke of Thornfield presenting an imposing figure of aristocratic authority as the massive oak doors swung open to admit Baron Harrington and 4 constables whose expressions betrayed their discomfort at being caught between 2 powerful noblemen. "I demand the immediate return of my wife," Harrington declared without preamble, his reedy voice echoing in the cavernous hall as he gestured imperiously with his walking stick and all pretense of frailty abandoned in his fury. "You have unlawfully taken what is legally mine, Thornfield, and I will see you imprisoned for this offense, regardless of your rank." Sebastian remained unmoved, his grey eyes cold as he regarded the man who had attempted to murder Eliza mere hours after exchanging sacred vows with her. Rather than responding directly to the accusations, he withdrew several folded documents from inside his coat and addressed himself to the lead constable, a greying man whose weathered face suggested years of service and the wisdom that accompanied such experience. "I believe you will find these papers of interest, Officer Blackwell. They contain sworn testimonies from servants present at the deaths of the Baron's 3 previous wives, along with documentation from a chemist in London regarding unusual purchases made by Lord Harrington shortly before each death." The constable accepted the documents with visible reluctance, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension between the noblemen as he unfolded the papers and began to scan their contents, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he absorbed the evidence Sebastian had gathered over 2 years of patient investigation. The Baron's face contorted with rage as he realized the nature of the documents being examined, his carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbling visibly as he recognized the imminent threat of exposure. "You've been a thorn in my side too long, Thornfield," he snarled, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss as his hand moved inside his coat with sudden purpose. Before anyone could react, he withdrew a small pistol concealed within his garments, leveling it directly at Sebastian's chest with unexpected steadiness for a man of his years. "I should have dealt with you when you first began asking questions about my dear departed wife, Amelia." A shot rang out in the enclosed space, the explosive sound magnified by the marble floors and high ceiling. Yet Sebastian remained standing, confusion flashing briefly across his face as the Baron's aim wavered. In the same moment, a cry echoed from the gallery above where Eliza had emerged from hiding, unable to remain concealed when she realized Sebastian faced mortal danger. Her sudden appearance distracted the Baron just enough for his shot to go wide, the bullet grazing Sebastian's shoulder rather than finding its intended mark in his heart. In the ensuing chaos, Sebastian lunged forward despite his injury, grappling with the Baron for control of the weapon as the constables rushed to intervene, finally wrenching the pistol from Harrington's grip and subduing the struggling nobleman whose mask of civilized propriety had vanished entirely, revealing the murderous rage beneath. The evidence and attempted murder of a duke proved too compelling even for the constables who had initially been reluctant to believe such accusations against a peer of the realm. As they secured the Baron's wrists with iron manacles, Sebastian staggered backward, the adrenaline of the confrontation fading to reveal the spreading crimson stain on his white shirt where the bullet had torn through flesh. he collapsed heavily onto the bottom step of the grand staircase. His face suddenly pale as blood loss and shock took their toll, while Eliza flew down the stairs toward him, her skirts gathered in her hands and terror evident in every line of her face as she reached the man who had once again placed himself between her and danger, this time paying a physical price for his protection. The library at Thornfield Hall transformed into a makeshift sick room as Sebastian was carried there on the urgent instructions of the family physician, Dr. Harding, who had arrived mere minutes after the Baron's arrest, summoned by Mrs. Winters at the first sign of trouble. The massive oak table where they had earlier spread their evidence was hastily cleared to become an impromptu operating surface where the doctor could extract the bullet lodged in Sebastian's shoulder. His instruments laid out on pristine linen as Eliza assisted with steady hands that belied her inner turmoil. Blood soaked through the makeshift bandages pressed against the wound, Sebastian's face ashen against the rich mahogany of the table as the doctor worked methodically to repair the damage, his expression grave but not despairing as he finally secured the last stitch and applied a clean dressing to the injury. "He will need constant attention," the doctor informed Eliza, as servants prepared the Duke's bedchamber for his recovery. "The wound itself is not mortal, but fever often follows such injuries and presents its own dangers. I shall return tomorrow to check his progress, but until then, cooling cloths and small sips of water when he wakes are your best course of action." Despite Mrs. Winters' gentle suggestion that she rest while others maintained the vigil, Eliza refused to leave Sebastian's side once he had been settled in his massive four-poster bed, the same fierce determination evident in her emerald eyes that he had referenced when explaining why he had kept his investigation secret from her. Through the long night that followed, she bathed his forehead with cool cloths as fever set in exactly as the doctor had warned, watching helplessly as Sebastian drifted between consciousness and delirium, his powerful frame now vulnerable in a cruel reversal of their positions when he had tended her through the aftermath of poisoning. During his brief moments of lucidity, he recognized her presence with a ghost of his usual smile before pain and fever pulled him back into restless unconsciousness. But it was during the delirium that his defenses truly crumbled, revealing thoughts he might never have voiced in full awareness. "I should have trusted you with the truth," he murmured during one such episode, his grey eyes open but unfocused as he clutched at her hand with surprising strength. "Should have found another way to protect you. Was a coward, Eliza, afraid of losing you to his vengeance. Gave you up instead, lost you anyway." His raw confession laid bare the conflict that had tormented him for 2 years, the impossible choice between keeping her close and risking her life, or pushing her away to keep her safe while sacrificing their happiness, a decision made from love, but executed through painful separation. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with pale light that filtered through the heavy curtains of the bedchamber, Eliza continued her unwavering vigil, watching the rise and fall of Sebastian's chest with each labored breath, her own exhaustion forgotten in the face of his need. "Now it is my turn to save you," she whispered, pressing her lips to his burning forehead in a tender echo of the moment he had forced the antidote past her lips after the Baron's poisoning attempt. "You protected me at the cost of your own happiness, Sebastian Thornfield. I will not allow you to pay the ultimate price for that devotion." Her quiet declaration hung in the stillness of the room as she resumed her careful ministrations, determined that the man who had sacrificed everything to shield her from harm would not succumb to the consequences of his protection, her love for him deepening with each revelation of the true depth of his devotion. However flawed its expression had been in the painful separation he had imposed to keep her safe from a danger she had not known existed until it nearly claimed her life. The weeks following the Baron's arrest brought gradual healing to Sebastian, his strong constitution responding well to Dr. Harding's treatment, as the wound slowly closed and fever abated under Eliza's constant care. By the time autumn painted the grounds of Thornfield Hall in russet and gold, Sebastian had regained enough strength to leave his bed for short periods, moving carefully to the library, where he could continue working on legal matters from the comfort of a well-padded chair positioned near the warmth of the hearth. Their peaceful recovery was interrupted one crisp October morning when Mrs. Winters announced the arrival of Mr. Willoughby, Sebastian's solicitor, whose grave expression as he entered the library portended unwelcome news despite his polite greeting. "I fear I bring troubling developments, Your Grace," he said after the initial pleasantries, glancing uncomfortably at Eliza, who sat nearby with her embroidery, having refused to be dismissed for what she rightfully considered a discussion that concerned her future as intimately as Sebastian's. Baron Harrington, despite being imprisoned awaiting trial, has filed legal papers demanding the return of his wife to his custody upon his release, maintaining that regardless of his alleged crimes, the marriage remains legally binding and his rights as a husband inviolable under English law. Sebastian's jaw tightened visibly, his hand clenching on the arm of his chair with such force that his knuckles whitened against the dark leather. "Surely attempted murder constitutes grounds for dissolution of marriage," he countered, his voice dangerously controlled as he confronted the solicitor, who shifted uncomfortably under his employer's intense gaze. "The law is unfortunately quite clear on this matter, Your Grace," Mr. Willoughby replied, his thin fingers adjusting his spectacles nervously as he delivered the unpalatable truth. "While the Baron's crimes will almost certainly result in his imprisonment, or possibly even execution given the evidence against him, the legal status of Lady Harrington as his wife remains unchanged unless an Act of Parliament is passed specifically dissolving the marriage. Such acts are exceedingly rare and generally granted only to the highest echelons of society when significant property or titles are at stake." The silence that followed this pronouncement hung heavy in the library as Sebastian and Eliza absorbed the implications of this legal reality, the crackle of logs in the fireplace, the only sound disturbing the tense atmosphere. After several moments, Sebastian turned to Eliza, his grey eyes reflecting determination despite the pallor that still lingered from his injury and subsequent fever. "I will find a way to free you legally, Eliza," he promised, his voice carrying the same absolute conviction with which he had once vowed to protect her from Harrington's murderous schemes. "I will petition Parliament myself if necessary, use every connection and favour at my disposal. I will not lose you again, not to legal technicalities after all we have endured." In response, Eliza set aside her embroidery and moved to stand beside his chair, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, in a gesture that spoke volumes about the evolution of their relationship from his unilateral protection to genuine partnership. "We will find a way together, Sebastian," she corrected gently, her voice steady with newfound confidence that had blossomed through the trials they had faced. "I am no longer the sheltered girl who needed protection without understanding the danger that threatened. From this moment forward, we face our challenges as equals, each contributing our separate strengths to overcome whatever obstacles remain between us and happiness." Her declaration, spoken without hesitation before both Sebastian and his solicitor, marked a transformation from the resigned young woman who had walked down the aisle to marry the Baron to a woman fully conscious of her own worth and capabilities, no longer content to have decisions about her life and safety made without her participation. Sebastian covered her hand with his own, acknowledging without words the shift in their dynamic, recognizing that his recovery and their future now depended as much on her strength as his own, a realization that seemed to bring him not diminishment, but relief after carrying the burden of protection alone for so long. The austere grandeur of the Old Bailey courthouse stood as silent witness to one of the most scandalous trials in recent memory, as London society packed the public gallery, aristocrats rubbing shoulders with commoners in their eagerness to observe the unprecedented spectacle of a baron accused of murdering 3 wives and attempting to murder a 4th. Lord Harrington sat in the dock, his previously commanding presence diminished by the prison garb that replaced his fine tailoring, though his expression remained one of haughty disdain as he surveyed the proceedings with the air of a man convinced of his immunity despite the evidence arrayed against him. The prosecution had presented a damning case over the course of several days, with testimony from servants who had witnessed suspicious circumstances surrounding the deaths of previous Lady Harringtons, a chemist who confirmed the Baron's regular purchase of unusual compounds, and medical experts who found the described symptoms consistent with specific poisons rather than the natural causes recorded on death certificates. The crowning moment arrived when Eliza Blackwood took the stand, her composure remarkable as she faced the man who had attempted to end her life, mere hours after speaking wedding vows. The courtroom fell into breathless silence as she recounted with clear, unwavering voice the events of her wedding feast, the unusual goblet presented only to her, the bitter taste of the wine, and most damning of all, the Baron's unguarded confession during their brief moment alone at Blackwood Manor when he believed no witnesses were present. "You should have died quietly, my dear. 3 previous wives did," she quoted, her steady gaze never leaving the Baron's face as she repeated the words that had revealed his true nature and confirmed Sebastian's suspicions. "He told me he would finish what he started, and that the Duke of Thornfield would hang for it. His intention to murder me and frame his grace was explicitly stated." The gallery erupted in shocked whispers at this testimony, ladies pressing handkerchiefs to their lips, while gentlemen exchanged grim glances, the scandal of a peer of the realm exposed as a serial murderer overshadowing even the unusual circumstances of a wife testifying against her husband in a society where such legal action was nearly unprecedented. The judge, a stern man with 4 decades of experience on the bench, listened with grave attention before turning to address the legal question that had loomed over the proceedings since their commencement. Given the extraordinary nature of these crimes and the overwhelming evidence presented, I hereby declare that Baron Harrington's attempted murder of his wife constitutes grounds for immediate annulment of the marriage. Lady Harrington shall henceforth legally return to her maiden name of Blackwood and be freed from all obligations and connections to the accused. The pronouncement sent fresh ripples of astonishment through the courtroom, such a ruling representing a radical departure from established precedent regarding the dissolution of marriage, yet the judge's expression brooked no argument as he continued. "The prisoner will be remanded to Newgate to await sentencing, which, given the severity and multiplicity of his crimes, will undoubtedly result in the maximum penalty under the law." As guards moved to escort the Baron from the dock, he suddenly lunged toward the barrier separating him from where Sebastian sat in the front row of the gallery, his face contorted with malevolent fury as he spat his final venomous words. "You will never be happy, Thornfield. You have stolen what is mine. Even from the grave, I will find ways to poison whatever joy you think to build on my defeat." Sebastian rose to his full height, his grey eyes cold as he regarded the man who had caused such suffering, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom as he delivered his response. "She was never yours to possess, Harrington. No human being belongs to another, regardless of documents or ceremonies. The law may have temporarily bound her to you, but her heart and spirit remained ever free of your claim. The Baron was led away in chains, his once powerful position in society permanently destroyed by the evidence of his crimes and the public revelation of his true nature." As Eliza descended from the witness stand, Sebastian moved forward to offer his arm in support, their unified departure from the courtroom representing not merely the triumph of justice over villainy, but the hard-won freedom to pursue the happiness that had been denied them through deception and threat. Beyond the imposing doors of the Old Bailey, autumn sunlight greeted them with unexpected warmth, seeming to herald a new beginning unburdened by the shadows that had haunted them both for far too long. 3 months later, spring arrived at Thornfield Hall in a glorious explosion of colour and fragrance, nowhere more evident than in the walled rose garden, where generations of duchesses had cultivated rare and beautiful varieties. The winter's chill had receded completely, leaving behind warm sunshine that coaxed the most magnificent blooms from carefully tended bushes, creating a private paradise of crimson, pink, and white blossoms nestled within ancient stone walls covered in climbing varieties. Sebastian guided Eliza through the iron gate that separated this intimate space from the more formal gardens, his hand warm and steady against the small of her back as they followed the winding gravel path between meticulously pruned rose bushes heavy with fragrant blooms, sir. The month since the Baron's trial and conviction had brought healing of both body and spirit, Sebastian's physical wound long since mended, while the deeper wounds of separation and misunderstanding had gradually yielded to the balm of honest communication and shared purpose. Eliza had remained at Thornfield Hall throughout the winter, her reputation technically compromised by residing in a bachelor's home, but the extraordinary circumstances of her rescue from a murderous husband and the Duke's convalescence from a bullet taken in her defense had provided sufficient explanation to silence even the most censorious voices in society. "The roses are particularly magnificent this year," Sebastian observed, as they reached a secluded stone bench nestled in a bower of crimson blooms, so dark they appeared almost black in the dappled shade. "Winters says they have never flowered so abundantly, as though celebrating something special." He guided Eliza to sit on the bench before surprising her by lowering himself to one knee before her on the gravel path, heedless of the damage to his impeccable trousers, his expression suddenly solemn yet illuminated with an inner light she had glimpsed only in rare, unguarded moments. "I have dreamed of this moment for 2 years, Eliza Blackwood," he said, taking her hands gently in his, as he looked up into her face with naked vulnerability rarely displayed by a man of his position and power. "You have known my heart at its darkest and most desperate, have witnessed my flawed attempts at protection, my misguided sacrifice of our happiness in pursuit of your safety. You have seen me at my weakest, both in body and spirit, yet somehow found capacity for forgiveness and understanding beyond anything I deserved." His voice remained steady, but softened with emotion as he continued, the words clearly rehearsed, yet no less sincere for their preparation. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my Duchess, not from obligation or rescue, but because 2 broken paths have finally converged? I offer not the protection of a title or the security of wealth, for you have proven your strength requires neither, but rather the devotion of a man who has learned through bitter experience that true love must be founded on honesty, trust, and partnership rather than mere sheltering." Sunlight filtering through the rose-covered arbor above them caught the tears that sprang to Eliza's eyes, transforming them to diamonds that sparkled against her lashes as joy illuminated her face from within. The painful journey that had brought them to this moment seemed suddenly worthwhile, each step of separation and suffering necessary to forge the deeper understanding they now shared, teaching them both that love without truth was merely a beautiful illusion, while love tempered by hardship and honesty could withstand any challenge. "Yes, Sebastian," she answered, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her shining eyes. "I will become your Duchess, your partner, your equal in all things." She leaned forward to place her hands on either side of his face, the gesture both tender and deliberate, as she sealed their agreement with a kiss that spoke of chosen commitment rather than arrangement or obligation, of a future built on mutual desire and respect rather than the social conventions that had nearly destroyed them both. Thornfield Hall's ancient walls had witnessed countless unions of convenience and duty throughout the centuries, marriages arranged for advantage or necessity rather than affection. But as Sebastian rose to enfold Eliza in his arms amid the blooming roses, the estate welcomed the promise of something far rarer and more precious, a match founded on genuine love and shared understanding, freely chosen by two people who had overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles to claim the happiness that had once seemed forever beyond their reach. Thornfield Hall stood resplendent in early summer glory, its ancient stones warmed by golden sunlight as carriages rolled up the tree-lined drive, delivering guests for the celebration of the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield's first wedding anniversary. The great house had been transformed for the occasion, every room filled with flowers from the estate gardens, the ballroom prepared for dancing, and the formal dining room set for a feast that would rival any in London society. Yet the atmosphere differed markedly from the tense formality that had characterized most aristocratic gatherings. Genuine warmth and affection evident in the greetings exchanged between hosts and guests as Sebastian and Eliza welcomed each arrival personally, their hands clasped together in a subtle but significant display of their profound connection. 1 year of marriage had only deepened the bond between them, their shared trials creating a foundation of trust and understanding rarer than the ancient title Sebastian carried. The transformation in Eliza was particularly remarked upon by those who had known her before her disastrous first marriage, the quiet, dutiful daughter of Lord Blackwood, replaced by a confident woman whose emerald eyes sparkled with intelligence and joy as she moved among her guests with gracious authority. When dinner was announced, Sebastian led Eliza to the head of the magnificent table where crystal and silver gleamed in the candlelight, the assembled company settling into their places with anticipatory smiles. As servants filled goblets with fine wine for the traditional anniversary toast, a momentary shadow crossed Eliza's face, the memory of another goblet and another toast briefly darkening her expression before Sebastian's hand covered hers in reassurance, the gesture observed and understood by those few guests who knew the full story of their journey to happiness. Sebastian rose to his feet, lifting his crystal goblet in a deliberate echo of that earlier fateful moment, yet with entirely different purpose and emotion infusing the gesture. "To my Duchess," he proclaimed, his deep voice carrying easily through the hushed dining room, "who taught me that protection without trust is not love." The lesson was hard-won but infinitely precious, as is the woman who imparted it. The assembled guests raised their glasses in response, murmuring their agreement as Eliza rose beside her husband, her own goblet held high as she offered her complimentary toast. "And to my Duke," she responded, her clear voice steady with confidence that would have been unimaginable in the young woman she had been 2 years earlier, who showed me that sometimes poison and cure come from the same hand. Their separation nearly destroyed us both, yet ultimately saved us for this moment and all that will follow. They drank together without fear or hesitation, the simple act of sharing wine transforming what had once been a weapon into a celebration, surrounded by friends who had witnessed various stages of their journey and understood the significance of this symbolic reversal. Later, as the evening mellowed and guests dispersed to the ballroom for dancing or the card room for less energetic entertainment, Sebastian found Eliza in his library, the room that had witnessed both his desperate attempt to save her from poison and his feverish recovery from the bullet he had taken in her defense. She stood before the shelves, carefully placing several volumes among his collection, the integration of her books with his, a visible representation of how thoroughly their lives had merged over the past year. He moved to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist as they both gazed at the mingled collection, her slender volumes of poetry and botanical studies now nestled comfortably beside his weightier tomes on history and law. Through the tall windows, the last golden light of the summer evening illuminated their reflection. Two figures standing as one against the backdrop of leather and parchment that represented accumulated wisdom of generations. Eliza turned within the circle of his arms to face him, one hand rising to touch his cheek, while the other came to rest upon her slightly rounded belly, where the first visible evidence of their future had begun to make itself known in recent weeks. The gesture needed no explanation. The joy in Sebastian's eyes as his hand moved to cover hers, expressing more than words could convey, as the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield stood silently together in the warm library light. Their journey from poison to cure, from separation to union, from secrets to truth, now complete in the promise of new life that would continue the legacy they had fought so fiercely to claim against seemingly insurmountable odds.